All right, Corey. I'm a big fan of your work. I know you uh work. I know you were a sports scientist. Worked for volleyball before. Worked for baseball before, and director of performance at the Kings with the Kings before. So before we dive into like all the training stuff, can we like introduce yourself a little bit for my audience?
Yeah. My name is Cory Kennedy, and you're right. I've been fortunate to do a whole lot of different things in sport performance in my career. Um, Early on was in a private facility, like you said, that we had a bunch of different Olympic athletes, but a lot of volleyball, a lot of club volleyball, Olympic beach volleyball, and so worked that was a big volleyball niche at the time and some basketball. And then I was able to work in Olympic sports for Canadian Olympic Committee, essentially one of their institutes for 6 years as the head strength coach. And that gave me even more exposure to different sports, individual sports, team sports, technical sports, physical sports, aesthetic sports. Um, and in the Olympic movement, it's very common for you to wear many hats just because different teams don't always have tons of staff. And so, um, I learned a lot in that environment from colleagues, from coaches who worked with, and that was a huge like strength coach and sports scientist environment. You're a strength coach, but you're collecting a lot of data, trying to figure out the sport, trying to figure out how to get Olympic medals. And so you're taking a very scientific approach to it. And from there, went to the Chicago Cubs in baseball, head of strength and conditioning and performance sciences. So same thing, overseeing, how we train and also how we collect data and look at our players and look at development. There had a great mentor in Adam Beard, and he had a great vision of how we were going to build things. And lastly, like you said, Sacramento Kings in the NBA as director of performance. So that's again verticals of nutrition, sports science, and strength and conditioning.
Nice, nice, nice. So before we start, I was like, before we start recording this. One of my player right now, he said like you are his favorite like strength coach like ever. So talk to me about that. Like uh I don't know, did you work with him just 1 year? How do you get that like relationship buy in and like even like he was with me right now, like he was still telling me like, man, you're the best. Tell me about that.
Well,
Tell me
one,
the secret.
I'm honored. Kessler's an awesome player, awesome guy. So that means a lot coming from him. But we picked him up at the trade deadline my first year. So we had, 8 weeks or so till the end of the season, and then he stayed around in the summer league, and then that next season. So a year and a bit. The secret to buy-in, I think you never know, it's different for everybody, but there's kind of a few things I think about. One, obviously getting to know them as people. Pro sports is so hard because they are people, and yet social media talks about them, the media talks about them, so many fans talk about them, and almost like they're objects. So that's number one. Number two, I think really using this sort of sports science strength and conditioning side to show them that you're a student of the game, that you're trying to understand the game and their performance. I think it's important to talk to them about what you're trying to do, why you think it matters, and making sure that they understand why you're doing it. And sometimes players disagree, right? Sometimes players have an idea of what they want to work on or need, and um, sometimes you have to sit down and go, okay, this is what my theory was, right? And I hear your theory, and then hopefully you come up with an arrangement where they trust you enough to go after what you're going to go after. And I think with Kessler, one, you spend lots of time together in the pros. You're there every day. And two, when he came in, one thing I liked to do as a director of performance for the Kings was anytime we got a new player, I like to spend a lot of time with them in the first 2 weeks. Like this is how we operate at the Kings, right? This is how we train, this is how we view training, this is how we build into the ecosystem. And so I would try to sort of take the player myself and like every day make sure there's a contact point where we're going through something and making sure we walk through why we like to do things the way we do. And so even his like first day in the building after we traded for him from Brooklyn, I got to see him sort of every day for the first couple of weeks of like, we're doing something here. This is how we approach, post game, pre game, day after, practice facility, things like that. So, it just happened that I got to spend a lot of time with him and he's super receptive. So it worked out.
Nice, nice, nice. So, um, outside of that, like, what is it like to work with different sports? Volleyball, baseball, obviously, volleyball, baseball, and basketball are very different. And I'm at pro right now. A lot of like before I step into this realm, like a lot of the guys were telling me that if you want to work in like pro basketball in the future, you got to stay in basketball. But obviously, like with you, with like even Andrew Paul, like a ton of guys in the NBA right now, they probably don't even have experience before they got into the league. So, can you share like your experience with different sports and like how did that help you grow as a professional? And how did that help you even when you work with basketball?
Yeah, I think it helps a lot as a professional. And to your point, it is challenging to be a young coach to decide how to invest your time, right? Because when we are hiring, and I hired in basketball, I hired in baseball, and hired in the Olympic sports, it is really easy to find someone with experience in that sport because you just say, they're going to walk into the building and know what it feels like, right? They know the routines are, and you can plug them in and go. Um, but, and I think there's a lot of research about that in terms of just generally learning, the more things you're exposed to, the more creative you get and the more kind of able you are to deal with different problems that come up because you now have this wide-ranging experience and applying it in different settings. So I do think being a generalist can be very, very valuable, but it does take a little bit of luck when being hired of someone who's willing to be open-minded to that versus, to your point, there are some organizations that will hire where you having 10 years of basketball experience is the most important thing they see, right? And that becomes a really tough challenge as a young coach to decide, do I explore or do I not explore? I would say that luckily with college, the chance to be in Olympic sports department where you see many sports can be a really beneficial year or two because you can hopefully get involved with many. But as far as helping, you know, it is interesting because I think there's two things. There's one, you start to see the things that are kind of universal across all sports. Like, okay, no matter what, this thing is true, and I've seen it work here, so there's no way it shouldn't work here, is one thing that can happen. But number two, you do also have to be like really mindful when you walk in. Like, what are the cultural things that you just don't want to say or do that's going to make you lose all respect, right? Like, unfortunately, there's language and how people talk about things and do things in basketball, in baseball, in volleyball, and you kind of have to be really observant your first few days of like how people refer to, the way they train, the way they play, parts of the game, so that you don't make a fool of yourself. Because, like you said, if you make a fool of yourself just talking about the sport, it may take you that much longer to get buy-in for the weight room, for doing exercises, for doing testing, collecting data. So you don't want to lose. I think that's the hardest is you don't want to lose respect early on because it's a new sport. Um, an example is like in baseball, you have to learn really quickly, like what's going on with the shoulder, the elbow. It's such an important part of the game. Injuries, performance, throwing is so huge that you have to understand quickly, like what are these routines and expectations and how do people deal with it. And then in basketball, your upper body is not near as talked about. Right now, all of a sudden you have to shift and understand knee, Achilles, calf, how are we handling it? How are we dealing with that? How do we talk about it? And so those are just, from an injury perspective, but you learn really quickly. or have to try and learn really quickly what that sport is about, right? What are the things that people are most concerned about in that sport? And the quicker you can tap into those, the quicker, you can be part of just part of the common thread, and no one sees you standing out, and then allows you to bring your varied expertise to the table at that point.
Mm. So, uh, can you kind of, I feel like I work with track and basketball a lot, and I feel like cultural difference is a huge thing in like all the sports. So
Hmm.
if you look at if I say like track athletes, they'll be very specific about like, oh, which part of my hamstring is tight, even which part of my hip is tight. But if you talk to a basketball player, it's like, I don't know, my legs are dead, my legs are tight, I don't know where. Right? You just have to figure
Yeah,
out. But if you talk to like track, they're like, yeah, this part of my legs are tight.
yeah, yeah. It's super interesting that part too, and then also just those expectations around lifting. I one of the first athletes I interacted with at the Kings, and I won't mention names, we'll keep this all anonymous, but for this story, um, you know, I had a great strength coach at the Kings, Zach Howe, who when I got in there, I said I started like the day before training camp. So like I walked in the building and it's on. And so luckily we agreed. I said, why don't you write programming for everyone for the next 2 weeks? Because like I haven't spent a day in the NBA before. Like you said, I've not in basketball. I don't want to walk in the first day and lose all respect by trying to do something that is completely foreign to them, right? Where they think I'm an idiot. So I said it'd be best, and I'll start to help train the athletes, interact with them, but like, you have a great feel for what they should be doing on the first 5 days of training camp. So, I want to empower you to do that. So kind of have programming laid out, and I was just gonna just help coach guys so that I could build that relationship and start right away. And one of the guys I'm with, and I take his weights for him for the exercise, say, here you go. And he said, yeah, no. And he put it back and got a lighter one. And I was like, no, but seriously, like look at you. You're a big strong guy. You can definitely handle this. And it was like, yeah, no, I'm doing this. And it just showed me like culturally, it's not that they don't want to be strong, but the feeling too of like training camp, a lot of running on the court, getting in and out, my perception of what they would be willing to do for heavy in that moment was definitely wrong, and um, they weren't in the mode to want to push themselves that way. So could this athlete lift that weight? Yes, but they were, thinking of training camp and preserving themselves for these next 10 days and everything like that. And it was just like a cultural moment of and this isn't, like I said, it's not just basketball specific, but it was, oh yeah, okay, here you can definitely do this, right? And then it was like, yeah, no, I'm not doing that today. I'm doing 60% of that today. And I was coming from baseball where even in the season, because the game is slower, there's a lot of players that are still willing to lift like maximally, within a week, right? At one or two times. Whereas once a basketball season starts, there's so much running that it's just a lot harder to get that moment of like your true, maximal deadlift or maximal anything. And so that was something that very quickly I had to learn, like, okay, yeah, they're not going to be wanting to do that, because of all the running they're doing and getting through the days. So that's where, to your point, figuring out the culture of the athletes and like what's a crazy ask and what's a okay, that's reasonable ask. You got to figure out pretty early so that they'll listen to you.
Yeah, I definitely like had that same experience. Like one of our athletes, like super talented, and he was like, every time I try to like add a little bit, no. I said, no. I said, come on, bro. Like it's not that heavy. No, no. I'm
Just
like, all
10 more
right,
pounds? No. Okay. Okay.
okay. I'm like, all right. I'm not gonna force it. Right. So, outside of that, is there any like anything you outside like besides lifting weight? Is there anything you had to learn when you like step into the basketball realm? I feel like especially basketball, is it like is really different than other sports.
Well, I think there's a few things. There's like you have to understand, which we already said, no matter what sport you're in, you have to know, like, first of all, what are the two or three major injuries that are going to be a problem. And you need to know how you're going to talk about it, right? Because it's not going to, it's what everyone's worried about. It's what your front office is worried about. Your coaches are going to be worried about it. Your players are going to be worried about it. And so, obviously, you don't want any injuries, but you have to understand, patellar tendon, Achilles, calf, because it's just going to come up, right? It's going to be something that you can't be caught, um, surprised by. And so I think that's one part of any moving to any sport. But then number two, I was always a big fan of basketball. I watched, but to your point about changing sports and what you know is I didn't know how we talked about plays. Like I don't like there's a lot of the language they use, different types of screens and picks and plays and stuff that I was like, well, so, I just don't. But what I think was important then is like spend as much time when practice is happening, listening, hearing, figuring out how, coaches are game planning and how players are being asked to play so that maybe you never have to fully, talk about plays, but you have to start to understand like how each player is valued and what that expectation is going to be because, basketball is one where you have your two or three high minutes people who are going to play a lot and expected to score and play both ways, and they're kind of relied on for everything. And then you have other players that might be subs that are relied on for very specific roles. Like I just need you to come in and rebound and run the floor and be physical. And it's like, okay, so understanding what you're kind of preparing your player for so that when you're talking to the player about training, you can kind of repeat the same messaging so that, everyone wants to one day be a 25-point scorer and make $100 million. But in the moment, you might say, hey, we're doing this so that you can stay explosive because you got to, rebound, you got to get up, you got to on the floor. And so this is how we're going to train. And so I think it was interesting because I was like, you obviously have to pretend that you're the expert now because you're in the building as a director of performance, but there were still aspects of basketball that I was like, don't quiz me on, some of these schemes, but at least I can figure out what's being asked of you from a from a functional standpoint and from a like a workload standpoint. And so I think that's always the most important part coming into a sport is you don't have to know everything, but you have to figure out what what the players are going to be expected to do, and how you're going to convey that to them.
Nice. The reason I spend a lot of time talking about this cultural difference is I work with basketball my whole life. So for me it's always like, yeah, this is what we do. We're not gonna do that. This is what we're gonna do things, right? And like in the past few years, I was like there's a there's some coaches want to like work with basketball and like I was helping them.
Yeah.
Then I finally realized that, oh, so there is a like cultural difference between different sport. And like it really took them time to understand the cultural difference to like blend in. So that's like the main reason like I spend a lot of time talk about this.
And it does make such a difference. But I do think there's one trap, and that's you've mentioned it, is that if you train basketball your whole life, you do kind of start to tell yourself that this is how it always is, right? And so I do think having a chance to speak to some other people and get some new ideas to go, oh, I wonder if I could make this work in basketball. But to your point, you just have to figure out where you're going to try it. You know, in the NBA world and where you are, it's probably going to be in the summer when you have younger players in every day and you have like 4 months before you kind of really get back to training camp where you say, oh, let's see if we try some of this, how they respond. If it's the very best players in the NBA and you're trying new stuff, that's a lot more risky. One, because you don't want to do something crazy that puts them at risk, but also culturally they might just go, this guy has no idea what he's talking about. That's not what we do, you know? And then again, you lose credibility and buy-in. So I think you got to be able to be curious and try new things, but you have to just figure out, okay, who are the players or the times of the year where I can experiment and figure out if this can hold, right? And if not, next training block, yeah, let's go back to a little bit more of what we're used to, right? And then, or
Yeah.
hey, that worked really well. That player responded, he liked it, we looks like he improved in this area, so now I'm going to do some more. And you mentioned Kessler. Um, one of the things I used to do with Kessler at the start of the summer is like try to really push maximum strength in some uncomfortable ways in the first couple of weeks, where stuff that we don't touch in the regular season, right? You just don't because we travel so much. The workloads are so high. Like I said, you don't get to true max. And then, I pushed him very hard with some things that are very uncomfortable. And then a couple of weeks later, you kind of pull back and go back to more comfortable stuff. But just that little bit of like, hey, here's a world where we can explore like really pushing strength, really doing stuff that you're not sure you can complete in uncomfortable ways with like, really heavy kettlebells in a rack position where like maybe you haven't really picked up kettlebells over 20 kilos before, or front and back squatting, which is not done very much in the NBA in season. Can you still do that heavy in the summer? And so I think to your point, you have to be really careful when you make changes, but you should always try to figure out where can I experiment to see if maybe this one thing I just heard about from another coach or I read about or I tried with a different sport might actually work here. But it can't be
Okay.
random. It's got to be planned.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Man, I should probably talk to you earlier because all the time Kessler is like, man, can we do max strength? Can we do max strength? Like every single time. I'm like, bro, like, I'm like, all right. That's cool. That's really cool. That's really cool. But uh, enough for the cultural thing.
Yeah.
I do want to talk to you about training. I was listening to the podcast you did with Hunter and Mike. That was a really good one. And you guys kind of talk about the archetype you mentioned.
Yeah.
So, can you start by sharing like how many like different types of athlete you would like categorize and like yeah, start by like how many types of athlete you categorize.
Yeah. And that, I think it can change all the time in that specific instance. So we were looking at maximum acceleration, maximum deceleration ability. So the actual value of their peak in-game data. And this all started because, when you're working with a sport, you want to always be able to say, do I understand like the first principle things that I can affect in training that are going to change performance, right? The thing about basketball that's so challenging is that you watch and sometimes some of these players, the skills of like a crazy jump shot and really acrobatic, layups and dunks, um, are incredible. But you look at that and it's not like we can train them how to do some of these really highly skilled things, right? Like it's far from the weight room. So we shouldn't try to, think about teaching Zion how to finish at the basket and stuff like we just don't have a place for that, even though maybe over time being stronger and stuff can help. So you want to always be able to come back and say, what are the things that we think we can measure that are going to impact play? And so for me, knowing that game data, is happening every 82 times, um, and that's when it's the one time, they're all giving their all, right? And they're trying as hard as they possibly can. And so, as you know, sometimes with like physical testing, like testing for strength, power, jumps, all these things, in a given year, there's certain times where it's very difficult to get full effort, and you just don't want to ask someone, the morning of a game to max strength test and things like that. So, in an NBA season, you've only got these certain windows to collect all of your different data, and so you just can't rely on it all the time. But one thing that you can do is get this game data, because the NBA uses Hawkeye, and Hawkeye's got um, you know very high amounts of data. So our hypothesis at the Kings was that maximal acceleration deceleration is something that every player uses because the ability to either create space or close space is going to matter. As a defender, as a guy trying to get to the basket, as someone trying to, create room for a jump shot. So that should matter. And if you can improve everyone's ability to accelerate, decelerate maximally, then they're probably going to show up in these things, whether it's getting to the basket, again, stopping someone from getting to the basket, maybe coming up for a block, right? All these things are acceleration, deceleration, just in different vectors. So once we started looking at that and looking at what it was, then we wanted to figure out, okay, is there a pattern to how different players who play the game sort of look in this metric? Because really, if you can figure that out and if it's true, then you have an expectation of what kind of values you want to be successful, right? Because if the five best point guards in the league all move a certain way, then if you want to be great, you should probably try to move like they do. And so that's how we went about it. And when we charted this in a sort of 3D landscape and um, did some clustering analysis, we ended up with I believe it was five qualities. And so when you looked at them, there was kind of like these super athlete, like sort of bigs. They were bigger guys, but they were kind of like big wings, or smaller bigs that were like super athletes that blocked a lot of shots, got to the rim. So that was kind of your big outlier. Kessler Edwards would probably almost fall into that since he could kind of play up positions at times because he's so long and physical. You had your like we'll call point of attack guards and defenders and scorer guards. So your smaller guys that are super explosive. We had your big bigs that were like barely moved, right? Because they're 7+ feet tall a lot of times. A lot of times they're really heavy. They're just not gaining a lot of space. We had a group that was um, I don't know how I described it on that podcast, but they were almost like star players that don't try. And trying to be as sensitive and mindful of that as possible. But like LeBron and Luca, for example, were both in that category where, you know, highly, highly skilled players, but over a course of a game aren't actually moving as explosively as you'd expect for guys that are, legendary and score the ball at a high rate, but they're not actually flying around the court in the way that, you'd expect from that kind of position. And what was the fifth one? I actually can't fully remember. I think there was one more category of like a power forward that wasn't quite as explosive. But either way, that was our process. So the key thing was that we weren't like we didn't go into it thinking we knew. It was really just letting an analysis of I think we did a k-means clustering for this one. Where what that means for people is just if you have like your data points in a geographical space, there's different methods of analysis that will just figure out who are the neighbors, right, to each other, where these groups seem to divide from each other. And from there, it was really up to us to kind of describe them by looking at who all the people were in the group. Because, data doesn't technically care if it's a scoring guard or not. They don't know the difference. They just see 15 players that have like similar numbers, and then it's up to us to go, oh, okay, that's, Anthony Edwards, De'Aaron Fox, blah, blah, blah. Okay, what do those guys have in common? So that was kind of how we went about it. I think there's obviously over time you could keep playing around with subdividing different types and ways and calling it different things, but that was just sort of how we looked at it. And I think that does a few things. Like I mentioned, I think one, you want to have an idea of whether your guys match up to what's expected of them. Like if you expect to be a scoring guard or a a guard who can defend scoring guards. You want to make sure that you can move the way they move. If they are way more explosive than you, you're going to need some other qualities in order to get make up for that. And so sometimes if you don't have length or anything else, then you just won't, and that maybe means you're going to be a G League player and never make the NBA. So knowing that and being able to then try to train to make sure guys fit in the role they're requested. And I think secondly, sorry, you can start to imagine a world where depending on your position in an organization, you can start to talk with your front office and coaching about that, right? Is it fair to be asking a player to do something where maybe he's not really capable, or vice versa? One thing that I always tried to do was like highlight players that are maybe surprising, right? I see the way people talk about him, and yet he's actually way more athletic game over game. Like we have a lot of data now that says this is, a super explosive person. I'll give an example of like Trey Lyles, who was on our team as a, power forward, small ball five, small ball big, very versatile player, did a lot of different things. He ended up because of his athleticism and the style of our offense is that he was often asked when we break out to sprint to the corners. And he would almost always have the highest max speed in game of both us and the team we played. So most of our games, he was like the fastest player on the court. Now, is he officially the fastest player on the court? No, De'Aaron Fox could probably beat him over a race, but the way that the game was played, he would often end up having the highest speeds reached. And being able to talk about it with the coaches and just say, hey, did you know that this guy is actually putting out, 90th percentile in the league speed on a game basis, and that like he is very athletic and he can do a whole bunch of things. It was actually really cool because I think players get bucketed into roles sometimes and people don't always realize, even though I'm not saying coaches don't know basketball, they know a lot, but sometimes they don't realize that, oh, there's actually more to this guy than I thought because of what he was asked to do before. No one saw it, right? And now it's like, oh, you can ask him to do this, and he can actually get up and down the court faster than anyone, and he can move around a lot more than you think. And so cutting and all these things, he might add a lot of value. So I think the archetyping is big for, you know, helping to direct training, but also helping to just talk about just player fit and stuff in a different way than just by skill sets, because obviously that's something we all see whether guys can shoot or not, but the other parts of the game and fitting into how you want to play, right? The culture of the game, how physical you want to be, how fast you want to be, and things like that can play a role.
Nice, nice. So before I dive into like the deeper like pra data or like training, I remember like so my mentor Adam Petway, he was always saying like if you look at like LeBron, Luca, Chris Paul, like those like top for performer in the league, they probably won't have the highest CMJ. They probably won't have the highest acceleration, deceleration, but they have higher IQ, so they know to be at the right place at the right time. And so my question is, if that's the case, then shouldn't we spend more time helping athletes understanding the game in some sense instead of just pushing outputs, uh chasing conditioning, all those stuff? Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm wrong.
No, it's a fair question. It's a fair question really for all sports, but this is a basketball example. The one thing I would say is that one, that would be the holy grail, right? Obviously, if you could figure out how to help a guy really understand where to be, where to go, uh, see where the play is going to be before it happens, kind of see what the other team's trying to do before it happens. That's the ultimate. And that's what coaches are, hopefully your basketball coaches are doing that. But the other things, the physical things can disqualify a player. And that's where I'd say it's all about, it's raising the floor. So conditioning, for example, can make a player really look bad in training camp, and that keeps them from making the team, right? Like, because after second practice, they're all of a sudden, a few steps behind. They're really breathing heavy. They show it. Like, coaches don't want to see that. They don't want to see they can't keep up with the game. Boom, they could be gone. So, you want to make sure they're conditioned enough that it's not in the way. I think CMJs and Excel and decel, because we'll call them all, sort of explosiveness and these qualities are the same kind of thing. You want to make sure that a player can do the things he's needed to, whether that's get in front of a certain offensive player, whether it's, get up and rebound and not get boxed out, and or when they put their head down to try and drive, can they get ahead so that they can get to the rim? We've seen guys where they come out in, like, you see this a lot in summer league just because you have so many players, and a lot of them won't make the NBA. It's like sometimes a guy will, pump fake or whatever, trying to attack a closeout by putting the ball down. And then all of a sudden, 2 steps later, they get walled off again, and they just don't have an ability to get to the basket. And in the NBA, you learn really quickly, like, oh my God, if this guy's not going to be able to do it, that's a whole part of the game that he's not going to have access to. With the special players, there's a chance that that level of IQ is maybe just so unique of the top 1% of the NBA that maybe it's not fully teachable by us, right? Like, and so I think obviously with the LeBron, Luka, and Chris Paul, you have this survivorship bias of these guys were elite athletes when they were 20, the best in the world. Especially LeBron and CP3. CP3 was a crazy athletic point guard when he came in. Um, but now those other skills have allowed them to stay elite, right? Whereas there is a world where sometimes a player is great when they're young, and when they lose the physical, they that that costs them their career. So I think it's not one or the other. Obviously, we have to continue to be amenable to, like, hey, how can I help translate this to skill? Um, because that is what it's all about, is showing up to the basketball court. But I also don't want us to ever forget that, like, there is a minimum floor that is going to allow these guys to compete and be on the court every day. And that's maintaining a certain amount of explosivity, maintaining that conditioning so that when they do get a chance, they can do a bit better in practice, and maybe, they can make up when they get an opportunity to play starter minutes for 15 games, and that actually creates an experience that they learn, right? Like, sometimes you see guys who just getting that exposure of playing time, you see them level up by learning the game. And if we can, the physical side can help provide for that, then that that's helpful.
Nice, nice. All right.
But otherwise, I can't teach guys how to finish, unfortunately, with both hands. And
Nice, nice. That's awesome. That's awesome. So, you mentioned like max SL, max XL, max decel. One thing I was like recently just pop up in my head is like the data we track with either LPS, GPS, whatsoever. Um, we got how many change direction, like acceleration load, deceleration load, uh, maximal XL, maximal decel, all this stuff. But would it change? Like, let's say we play a certain team, they like to like uh I don't know, a certain team they like to play a different way.
yep.
They like to shoot a lot of threes, or the certain team they like to like uh pass the ball to their bigs. Like, does those like metric change when the team who play their tactic change? Would it change a lot?
Yeah, sometimes. And that's where collecting this data over an entire season and over, kind of only reporting certain things over multiple games sometimes is helpful. But for example, with those maxes, one of the reasons we settled on maxes as this identifying feature was that within 48 minutes of play, the chances that you, Eric, are starting point guard, no matter what, have to have a moment of burst of like catching a guy or getting to the bucket or whatever, even in a half court situation, the chances are that given, and for us, and my analysis was that you needed 10 minutes of playing time to be sure that it was reliable on these maxes. So if a guy only got in for 3 minutes, you actually didn't know that they had a chance to actually like fully exert. Once that happened, those metrics were reliable. Like you would likely have the chance to perform maximally at least once or twice. What was going to change a lot by style was total distance and the total number of these exertions. Like you might have 20% less total high excels or decels, but the max values will still show. And so it changes how you think about reporting data, right? For me, it's like that way I could be confident that if your maximums were going down over multiple games, that that likely was about you and not gameplay. But if it was just a lower distance or the total number of exposures, that might not be the athlete's fault. That might be like we played a team that plays half court offense, uses the full 24-second shot clock, right? And does whatever. And so for us, there's certain things like the pace of play was really impacted by the other team, right? Overall pace of movement, I'll call it. While I was with the Kings, we were a fairly aggressive team. We played at a very high pace of play for most of that time. And if you played another team with a high pace of play, at the time, Memphis was like this, Indiana was like this, Golden State at times was like this. Uh, you know, both teams would put up crazy numbers of distance and number of high speed events. And then even though we still like to play that way, if we played at the time one of your teams, Denver, and the Knicks, a few teams that really slow the game down on offense, especially in play like a half court style, that's where those would go way down. So the team's offense does have a big impact on total load. So when you're reporting, you have to take into account that context, um, especially when you're trying to describe what players are going to go through or not against certain teams. Um, but there's some data that is going to still happen. Like I said, those maxes should still occur against the Denver and New York, whatever. You're just going to have less of them, but you should still be able to hit your personal max once or twice in a game, just because of these key defining moments still happen. End of a shot clock, scrambling to make a block or get to the rim or do whatever.
Nice.
But it is true that you have to kind of figure out context for some of this data, though.
This kind of gave me a yeah, different understanding of the GPS or LPS data because we used to only track, well, at Louisville, I can't say what I track now, but at
Yeah,
Louisville, like we also used to only track player load and player load per minute.
yeah,
But like we mentioned, like sometimes, especially player load, like a lot of dictate by how many miles they run. So the player load sometimes vary a lot.
yeah.
And even like player load per minute also vary a lot sometimes. So I was like, okay.
You know what? In terms of just general workload monitoring, I think it's mostly fine, right? If you just use player load or player load per minute in terms of understanding like how fatigued someone should likely be from the session. But to your point, there's so many different ways of getting at it that when you are working within a team, it's really important to start to understand those differences. And so, an example, I don't know how you guys do it, but almost every NBA team does some sort of like sessions where they try to get players with lower minutes to top up work. Can be games or fitness or different things, so that they're kind of everyone on your team is sort of ready with the same level of fitness. And so for me, I would use that LPS data and game data to try to change my recommendations for some of those games from day to day. So we might all be trying to get 1,250 units of load, for example, but one day we might do it half court and try and get lots of high intensity accels and decels, by having short stops and starts. And another day, for different fitness purposes, we might say, okay, let's just go 3-on-3 full court. It'll probably take a little bit less time to get that player load because if they're running up and down, as you know, that that player load's probably going to go up quicker, but they're actually not getting near as many accels and decels, but they're getting a ton of mileage, and it's like let's have a running up and down the court day, and other times it's like a super intense half court day is going to be a different type of player load, but it's going to be, way harder on starts and stops and lateral movement. Um, and that's where figuring out your kind of different buckets of data from those systems can help over time, like you said, to especially if you want to expose athletes to different skills. Where we do have I told you we can't really teach all basketball IQ and stuff, but what we can do is help recommend that athletes are getting exposed to different styles of gameplay and different skills in the game. Where if I just said 1250 every day, we might all of a sudden just start playing that same 3-on-3 every day. Everyone's running up and down the court, they're getting their 1250, but all of a sudden it's like, oh wow, we haven't really practiced what like really intense half court is going to be like in the playoffs or whatever. So things like that, it's where the LPS and the um, IMU systems can be super helpful. Is that yes, there's general workload of hitting your loads, but what style of play was it, and can we do a little bit more variety to make sure that we're getting exposed to different types of stops and starts and or flat out running. Like you also don't want to go too long without running the court because some team might come in the next game and all of a sudden they're just running the doors off you and you guys look like they're not ready. Not to mention like exposure to risk of hamstring or other things from high speed running. So to your point, it's super valuable tool and it's not going anywhere. Everyone's going to continue to use at least IMUs and a lot of places will install their infrastructure for LPS as well. And so the more that you can understand the different signal in them, the more that it can help you as a coach recommend different types of work for players.
Nice. All right, so uh you don't have to share like what exactly do you guys track, but like with the knowledge you have right now and the context you just gave me, doesn't like have to be a certain team, but like would you say like what would some metrics you would track if you I don't know are director of sports science or director of performance again? Like what are some metrics you would track in terms of like just uh GPS IM LPS IME whatever.
Yeah, I think player load number one is still the thing. And even though it's super generic and people sometimes are worried about like, oh, but I don't understand what went in it. These things are extremely reliable in terms of, you know, 1,000 load day is a similar feeling to 1,000 load day most of the time. And so going from 1,000 to 2,000 is likely going to result in a big surprise and shock to your athletes. And so number one, I think understanding the bandwidth of player load that, you know, can and can't, should and shouldn't be tolerated is obviously still number one, even though it's a very general concept. Then number two, I think looking at, and it depends like and for those listening that don't use these systems, with an LPS system, you're essentially mapping your courts and with that, cameras everywhere. And so that you can actually measure distances and acceleration and deceleration of velocity. Um, so that you get more clarity on these maximal rates of accel, how much, speed, and things like that. With IMUs, they're obviously just feeling for a change in position in this sort of unknown 3D space. And so these companies are very good. Typically, Kinexon and Catapult are the two big ones in the NBA. But there are a few other brands that are, have IMUs and LPSs, but they're very good at taking that kind of raw basic signal and assuming a little bit more of the movement that comes with it. But at the same time, they're not going to fully report all the same info. Um, and so you're kind of estimating distances and loads from that, but you're not getting the same. So understanding, okay, I have a bunch of accelerations in terms of movement, but I can't say, yes, I hit, 8.75 meters per second squared. So the IMU is a little bit more general, but you can still understand if this was like a hard stop start type of session or a running type of session. So figuring out total load, time, time is massive. I think people with these technologies underrate how much time on your feet is going to lead to these high player loads. And so just constantly being aware of how long people are out there will probably allow you to not be surprised sometimes, like, oh shit, that was a bigger session than I thought. Um, we used to sometimes ask players, oh, how did that session feel today as good feedback for the types of sessions that we could play in the future. And one thing that I found in baseball when we got catapult, and I found in basketball too, is that a short, intense session is usually perceived better by players than a long, slow session, even if the workload might end up being very similar. So, like you said, the player load might still be 1,000, but if you can get that 1,000 done in 40 minutes, even though it's, you know, intense, the fact that they get off their feet in 40 minutes, a lot of times they'll perceive that as a bit easier. A lot of coaching, a lot of standing around, a lot of move, a lot of different drills can sometimes make guys go like coaches will look at it and think, oh, that was an easy one because there was no intensity. But if it ends up taking an hour and 40 minutes, players will be feel like they were out there all day. And so total player load, time, and then like I said, figuring out the high intensity exertions. If you have the LPS, you can actually track like how close you got to game intensities. If you have the IMU, then you're at least just trying to see like how many of these are have we done, because you want to kind of know what type of practices you are and aren't doing, and how it relates to gameplay. Like I said, you need to be able to understand what light, medium, and heavy look like in data. So that when you're talking to coaches and players, it's not just prescribing, because some teams aren't going to let you prescribe. They've got their plan, they're going to do it, but also how we react, right? How we see what the players are doing and know, okay, I now can predict how he's going to feel when he gets off the court for the next 24 hours. And so that's going to change now what I was going to do in the weight room, right? And the quicker you can kind of figure that out, the quicker you can adapt your stimulus, whether that's different type of training, whether it's, hey, I do want you to do this recovery stuff today, or no, not necessary. We can just do whatever. And hey, what type of conditioning might be a good idea, right? Hey, oh, based on that, I can't ask him to also run a whole bunch. So now it's like today's a bike conditioning day, get him less on his feet. Or, you know what, it's just a sauna day. It's that intensity is high enough that like I can get 10 more minutes of, zone one, two, but I shouldn't ask him to do output. So really those sort of three basic categories. Now I find distance not as big a deal in terms of like reporting on it much. It is, you talked culture though, it is something that sometimes players know of. And so they ask, how far did I run today? What was my mileage? How did I? And I just find in terms of basketball performance, it's just a little bit more predictive of looking at accelerations and decels than it is mileage, but mileage will usually fit to player load pretty closely. Like, if someone did, 2 miles or 2.5 miles or in a game, like you can say, oh, okay, that was a really big one for you. You're usually only at 1.8 or whatever. But for the most part, I always find mileage is like a silly one for basketball where I'd rather not talk about it if I don't have to. But if players ask, it's like, okay, we'll talk about the context of how much you ran. But really, it's the stops and starts and how intense they are that I usually want to know.
Nice, nice. All right, so uh, when it comes to like session intensity, do you feel like I don't know, this is just me thinking because I was obviously like like people are looking into like deceleration a lot more, and um a lot of injury actually happens when you try to decelerate. So when it comes to like understanding the session's intensity, do you look at stuff like uh do you think deceleration per minute or like acceleration per minute, or like what would be most closer, what would be the closest thing for you as like a like or what would be the metric for you to decide like this is a high intensity or this is low intensity session?
Yeah, usually I would look at the total, like again, I like to frame things back to games and understanding, okay, what does my and it almost go all back to those archetypes of like this type of player is going to end up with like say a dozen very high acceleration decelerations in a game, and then it's like this type of player maybe five, and then some players are zero. And then I like to then work back into practice and look at the same. I try not to look at just basic accels and decels per minute because it counts everything. Like every little thing you move almost registers when there's no threshold for these higher intensities. And so usually I would look high and very high to see if this is an actual session that had like legit game like events or just lots of moderate events. So that way you can kind of work back and say like, okay, this session looked game-like because I know players stopped and started at an intensity like they would in a game. If you have a session where no one on your team had any very highs, then you know like, oh, even these highest explosive players didn't have to do what's normally required of them, then I know that that's likely a lighter or medium session, right? Um, and then vice versa, if you can get a session where the players that don't even always get them in games got them, right? Like, oh wow, we did so much scrimmaging, or this type of 3-on-3 drill was so intense that even the guys that don't normally get them in an NBA game got five today. Then I know that it was, extra intensity. So I don't like to look at the rates of the lower stuff. I really like to see above a threshold of moderate so that you have like high and very high to really judge like the overall intensity of the session. Um, Beyond, like I said, the player load, which is not intensity, it's obviously a combination of volume and intensity, really more of a volume. But the
Mm,
volume will be the general first look, and then number two will be those very high events, which you could do either as a rate high and very high per minute or just total events. Especially if you have an idea of like, hey, I know that this guy would usually do 10-ish in a game. So now I know like, yeah, he did 10 today or he did 20. So this is like two games worth almost for him.
mm, nice, nice. All right, last question before I let you go. So, obviously, like working in pro sport, you gotta communicate with different department, like strength coaches, athletic trainer, PTs, coaches, front office. So, uh, how do you handle like those communication, like when maybe your opinion are different than uh AT's opinion, your opinion are different than PT's opinion. And like how do you guys get on the same page on like certain cases?
Yeah, I find this is where, being able to sit down and whiteboard stuff can be really helpful, education, discussion. So one of the things is that ATs are different than PTs and they're different than performance coaches in the way that they see the world. And that's super important. And nobody's actually right or wrong, right? But how we view like injury prevention, like for example, me, I always think of injury prevention as a big thing about exposure to like loads and intensities, right? A lot of time the medical side come up through muscles, joints, kinematics, and they think about things because they spend their whole day moving muscles and joints and touching, that they think about how things move and whether things are weaker than others and balance. And there's a whole world there that is real. But for me, my priority is like, he did twice as much as he done yesterday. This is going to be a problem. He's weak, and these are really high intensity, events. This is a problem. And so sometimes we just have to sit down and kind of go, hey, our data in the research may show this that you just haven't seen as much, right? That this world is real. But at the same time, I totally respect your expertise and I want you to be clear about what you see and feel with the athlete. Uh, and then, there's sometimes a question of hierarchy and stuff like that. Like in the case of the Kings, medical and performance are side by side. We don't boss each other around, but at the end of the day, I was also the person that would, do practice planning stuff with coaches. It wasn't like a unanimous decision. So I can kind of decide on some bigger principle stuff with the how maybe how I recommend practice, but then when we're talking about athletes, we have to figure out how to discuss together. And that's where, you know, we may have differences of opinion. And it's like, okay, how can you explain yours and what you see, and how can I explain mine? And I will say you do have to constantly remind yourself that my way isn't the only way, right? Like because we just see the world differently, and you have to remember that. Um, because sometimes what you think is silly isn't, it's real. It happens, but it's just not how we, with what we do with strength and conditioning and training and sports science, have like learned the world, and vice versa. Some of them have seen and felt so many legs and people and things that their knowledge is real, but it's just a different perspective than like global load monitoring, for example, or overall looking at strength and things like that. So there's no right answer. I would say that it's definitely the big one of the biggest challenges in our field is how do you constantly find a great working relationship between health and performance, medical and performance, because there's times where we see the world very differently, and yet we're kind of operating on the exact same thing, right? Same bodies, same thing, same goal, and yet we have to be able to both apply our expertise at the same time. And so I think a huge one is, like I said, give them the benefit of the doubt where you can. Obviously, every once in a while, there's like a decision that needs to be made that's high level enough that someone needs to say, yes, no, right, wrong, this is what we're doing. But in the daily basis, try to give them the benefit of the doubt as often as can. Like you, I, I, I trust you, I believe you. But as often as you can, also like say, hey, let's sit down after and discuss. This is how I see the world. This is what I think I know. Like, does this evidence seem compelling? And sometimes they might say, I've seen that evidence. You know what? That's not as compelling as you think it is. It's like, okay, I hear you. Or sometimes it's, oh, I didn't think about it that way. Now I might start to think about it, and we can talk about it in that frame of reference. So you need to make an effort to also like be on the same page, not just about that athlete, but in general. How do we see the world as an organization? How do we see health and performance and these key, philosophical points of training load, of intensity, of how much does the weight room matter and strengths matter? How much does these previous histories matter? How much does, their more qualitative, maybe appearance matter? And how much does how they feel matter? How much does how their muscles feel matter, right? And kind of get on a page of like, this is how we're gonna make our decisions, but this all the information matters. And so that's the million-dollar question, though, is like, how do you have a great working relationship? And it's like you got to both be hopefully human, willing to listen to each other, and then put as much information as you can of like, I think the key is like, can you explain what you believe so that they at least understand where you're coming from?
Nice, nice, nice. That's perfect. That's all the question I have for you today. Appreciate you, Corey.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate it. Thank you for the invite.